In the quiet farming village of Marinpur, time seemed to move slower than the wind that rolled across the wheat fields. The soil there was rich, but the people were struggling. Years of unpredictable weather, rising fuel costs, and broken-down machinery had pushed many farmers to the edge. Some had already sold their land. Others were waiting for the same inevitable fate. Elias was not new to hardship. At 62, his hands told the story of his life, scarred, cracked, and permanently stained with oil and soil. He had inherited his farm from his father, who had inherited it from his own. It was more than land to him. It was identity, memory, and legacy all in one, but legacy did not pay for spare parts or fuel. His barn had become a graveyard of broken machines. One tractor had a dead engine. Another had wheels that no longer aligned. Even the irrigation pump only worked when it felt like cooperating. And at the farthest corner of the barn, hidden beneath a torn tarp and layers of dust, sat the crawler. Nobody really called it by name anymore. To everyone else in the village, it was just scrap metal. The crawler had been there longer than Elias could remember. He bought it years ago from an auction in a nearby town where it was listed as non-operational agricultural equipment. At the time, he didn't know why he bought it. Maybe it was hope disguised as impulse. Maybe it was stubbornness. Either way, it had never worked properly, not once. That morning, two scrap dealers arrived at his farm in a rusted pickup truck. They walked through his land with the confidence of men who had already decided its value. One of them, a thin man chewing on a matchstick, pointed toward the barn. "We heard you've got an old crawler sitting here. We'll take it off your hands, give you enough cash for parts at least." The other laughed. "Parts? That thing is only good for weight in a junkyard." Elias didn't respond immediately. He wiped his hands on a cloth and looked toward the barn door. The wind pushed against it slightly, creaking like it was trying to speak. "You're wasting your time, old man," the first dealer added. "That machine's dead." Dead. The word lingered longer than it should have. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Everything that's built can be repaired." The dealers exchanged amused glances. "Not that," the second one said. "That's scrap pretending to be machinery." They made an offer anyway, barely enough to fix one of his smaller tractors. It was insulting, but not unusual. They were not the first to underestimate him, and they would not be the last. When they left, dust trailing behind their truck, silence returned to the farm, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy. Elias walked into the barn. The crawler sat exactly where it always had, its metal body swallowed by rust and shadow. Thick chains hung loosely from its frame, and its cabin windows were clouded with grime. Most people saw junk. Elias saw something else, something he could not explain, only feel. He placed his hand on its surface. Cold still, but not empty. He frowned slightly, as if reacting to a thought he couldn't quite grasp. That was the moment he decided not to sell it. Over the next few days, Elias began working on it, not because he was sure it would work, but because he needed to know why he couldn't let it go. He started simple, cleaning, scraping away layers of rust, replacing brittle wires, checking hydraulics that hadn't moved in years. Each task revealed something unexpected. The machine wasn't built like modern equipment. Its structure was heavier, more complex, almost intentional in ways he didn't understand. One afternoon, while cleaning beneath the main chassis, he noticed something unusual, a set of engraved markings, partially hidden beneath grease and corrosion. They weren't factory labels. They looked handmade, modified. Elias squinted at them. "What are you?" he muttered. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the crawler not as scrap but as something waiting. The next morning he returned to the barn earlier than usual. Birds were still waking up across the fields. The air smelled of damp earth and early sunlight. As he worked, something strange happened. When he tightened a bolt near the engine casing, he felt a faint vibration travel through the metal like a pulse. He stopped immediately, holding his breath. The barn was silent except for the distant sound of wind. He placed his hand again. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, telling himself it was fatigue. But as he turned away, the crawler's frame creaked, softly, almost imperceptibly, like a tired breath returning after a long sleep. Elias froze. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Then slowly, a thought formed in his mind that he could not dismiss. This machine wasn't just old. It was waiting. And something about that realization made everything he had known about his farm feel suddenly uncertain. He turned back toward it, his expression changed, not fear, not excitement, but something in between. And for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel like he was fixing a machine. He felt like he was waking something up. By the third day, Elias' routine had changed completely. He no longer checked the fields first thing in the morning. He went straight to the barn as if pulled by something he could not name. The crawler had become the center of his world again, not because it was useful, but because it was beginning to feel alive in ways he could not logically explain. The villagers noticed the change before he said a word. Old Mr. Haroon from the neighboring farm shook his head one afternoon while passing by. "Elias has finally lost it," he muttered to his son, talking to scrap metal like it's going to feed his fields. Others were less subtle. "You should stop wasting time on that junk," someone shouted from the road one morning. "It's been dead for years." Elias didn't respond. He rarely did anymore. What mattered was inside the barn. The crawler was slowly changing, not in appearance but in presence. Elias had cleaned away enough rust to reveal more of its structure. Beneath layers of decay, the machine looked far more advanced than anything he had ever worked on. The frame wasn't standard agricultural steel. It was reinforced in patterns that made no sense for farm equipment. The wiring system, too, was unusual, bundled in ways that suggested redundancy far beyond necessity. One evening, while inspecting the engine housing, Elias discovered something that made him pause. A compartment he had never noticed before. It was hidden behind a false panel, sealed with bolts that didn't match the rest of the machine. Someone had deliberately concealed it. His hands moved carefully as he removed the panel. Inside was a small metal casing, and on it, faint but still readable, were engraved letters. "Prototype unit, do not decommission." Elias leaned back slightly. The words didn't belong to anything he recognized from local farming equipment. This wasn't a modified tractor. It wasn't even industrial salvage. It was built for something else. Something heavier. Something more intentional. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind, not about whether the machine could work, but about why it existed at all. That night, he stayed in the barn longer than usual. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the wooden walls. The crawler sat in silence, its frame casting long shadows under the dim hanging bulb. Elias placed his hand on its metal surface again. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered. "You're not supposed to be here." As if responding, the crawler's frame emitted a faint metallic click, not movement exactly, more like pressure shifting inside sealed components. Elias stepped back instinctively. His heart beat faster. He waited. Nothing else happened. But sleep did not come easily after that. The next morning, 2 children from the village sneaked into the farm out of curiosity. They often did this, watching Elias from a distance, whispering about the crazy old farmer and his ghost machine. They peeked into the barn when they thought no one was around. "What is that thing?" one of them asked. "It's just junk," the other replied. But as they stepped closer, the crawler seemed different, not moving, not active, but no longer entirely lifeless either. One of the children swore later that the machine felt like it was watching them. They ran off laughing, but their voices carried unease. By midday, more villagers had gathered near the fence line. Word spread quickly in small towns, especially when something unusual disturbed the routine of survival. People pointed, joked, and laughed. "Elias thinks he can bring it back to life. Maybe he'll start talking to it next. He should sell it before it collapses on him." Elias heard all of it. He kept working. He replaced damaged hydraulic lines, cleaned fuel channels, tested electrical connections. Each repair revealed more of the machine's hidden structure. It was not random engineering. It was layered, deliberate, and far more advanced than expected for something labeled farm equipment. At one point, he found himself comparing it to modern tractors in his mind, and realizing they looked simpler in comparison. That thought unsettled him more than anything else. Late in the afternoon, while tightening a set of bolts near the rear stabilizer, something unexpected happened. The crawler vibrated again. This time stronger. Not enough to move, but enough to feel unmistakable. Elias froze. The sound came next. A deep, low mechanical hum, not from outside, but from within the machine itself. He stepped back immediately. The barn fell silent except for that hum, growing faintly before fading again like a breath held and released. Elias stared at it, chest rising slowly. "No," he whispered, "that's not possible." But it had happened. And for the first time since he had owned the crawler, Elias understood something important. This machine wasn't refusing to die. It was waiting for permission to wake up. And someone somewhere in its past had made sure it could. The morning the village gathered at Elias' farm, the air felt different. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was anticipation mixed with disbelief. Word had spread fast. "The old man is trying to start the scrap crawler," people said. Some came to laugh, others came simply because there was nothing better to do. In places like Maranpur, even failure was worth watching if it broke the monotony of daily struggle. By mid-morning, a small crowd had formed near the fence line. Children climbed onto wooden posts. Farmers leaned on tools they hadn't used in years. Even those who had mocked Elias now stood there quietly, waiting. Inside the barn, Elias didn't notice them at first. He was focused entirely on the machine. The crawler had changed again in subtle ways over the past days. Not visibly, no dramatic transformation, but something about it felt more complete, like missing pieces were slowly finding their place. He had repaired what he could understand. The rest he had simply cleaned, tightened, and hoped for the best. Today he was going to try starting it. He checked the fuel lines one last time, then the wiring, then the ignition system that didn't match any manual he had ever seen. There were too many unknowns, but too late to stop now. Something inside him refused to step away. Outside, someone shouted, "Just started already." A few laughed. Elias ignored them. He climbed into the crawler's cabin. The interior was just as strange as the exterior. The controls were heavy, industrial, but arranged in a way that suggested precision rather than brute operation. There were levers he didn't recognize and gauges that barely moved even when he tested them earlier. He placed his hand on the ignition switch. For a moment he hesitated. Not because he doubted himself, but because he felt like he was crossing a point of no return. Then he turned it. Nothing happened. A sigh went through the crowd outside. "I told you," someone muttered. Elias didn't react. He tried again, adjusting a secondary switch he had discovered under a panel the day before. Still nothing. A few more voices rose in amusement. The moment was becoming exactly what the villagers expected. Then something changed. A low vibration echoed through the floor of the barn. Elias froze. The crawler's frame shuddered, not violently but deeply, like something massive shifting awake after a long sleep. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. The metal beneath his hands grew warm. Outside, the crowd fell silent. "What is that?" someone whispered. Elias leaned forward, his eyes locked on the control panel. A faint glow, barely visible at first, flickered inside one of the gauges. Then came the sound. A deep mechanical groan, rising slowly from within the machine. Not a malfunction, not a breakdown. Something awakening. The crawler exhaled. That was the only way Elias could describe it. A long, heavy release of pressure and silence broken after years of stillness. The engine didn't roar like modern tractors. It didn't sputter or struggle. It responded. A rhythmic pulse filled the barn, steady, deliberate. The entire machine vibrated in a controlled pattern, as if calibrating itself to life. Elias' hands stayed on the controls, barely breathing. Outside, the first person stepped closer to the barn door. Then another. The murmurs stopped completely. And then movement. The crawler shifted. Slowly at first, a deep mechanical adjustment as its internal systems engaged. One of the massive treads tightened, grinding slightly against the barn floor. The sound echoed like thunder trapped inside metal walls. Elias adjusted the lever instinctively. The crawler responded. It rolled forward just a few inches, but it moved. A gasp broke from outside. No way. That thing actually works. The disbelief in their voices turned into something else, something heavier. Shock, unease, awe. Elias guided the crawler forward again. This time it moved more smoothly. The barn creaked under its weight, but the machine held steady. Systems that should have been dead were functioning with eerie precision. Lights flickered on inside the cabin, dim, amber glows that hadn't been there before. Elias felt it then. Not just control. Connection. As if the machine wasn't simply obeying commands, but understanding them. Outside, someone shouted, "It's alive." The word spread through the crowd like wildfire. The crawler rolled forward into the open light of the yard. Sunlight hit its rusted exterior, and for the first time, people saw it not as scrap, but as something far more imposing. Its scale became clear. Its structure didn't resemble farm equipment anymore. It looked engineered for endurance, for force, for something beyond ordinary use. Elias brought it to a stop. Silence followed. No laughter now. Only staring. A man in the crowd stepped back slowly. That thing, it shouldn't be moving. Elias remained in the cabin, his expression unreadable, but inside something had shifted. This wasn't just repair anymore. This was discovery. And as he looked over the silent faces outside, he realized something else. They had all come to watch him fail. But now none of them knew what they were looking at. And neither did he. Not yet. After that day, everything in Maranpur began to change, not all at once, but in subtle shifts that built tension like a storm gathering behind the horizon. The crawler was no longer a joke. It was no longer scrap metal either. It had become something in between, something people didn't yet have a name for, and that uncertainty made them uneasy. Elias noticed it first in the way people watched him. Where there had once been laughter, there was now silence. Where there had been dismissal, there was now calculation. Men who had ignored his farm for years suddenly found reasons to pass by. Some stopped at the fence too long, others asked questions they pretended were casual. How much fuel does it take now? Where did you get parts for it? Is it even safe to run something that old? Elias gave few answers. Because the truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. The crawler worked, but not in any way that matched expectation. It didn't behave like a restored machine. It behaved like a system that had been partially awakened. Each time Elias operated it, it seemed to learn. Its response became smoother. Its movements more precise. Even the vibrations changed, less like strain, more like controlled power waiting beneath restraint. One afternoon, Elias tested it in the open fields. The soil there was thick and uneven, full of deep ruts from years of failed irrigation cycles. Modern tractors struggled here. Wheels sank. Engines overheated. Progress was slow and frustrating. The crawler did not struggle. It advanced through the terrain with steady force, its treads gripping earth that should have stopped it. Where other machines slipped, it held. Where others stalled, it continued. A group of farmers watched from a distance, unable to speak for several minutes. That's not possible, one finally said. But it was happening. Elias himself felt it too. The machine was not just powerful, it was adaptable. As if it was adjusting itself in real time to conditions, redistributing force internally, compensating for uneven ground without instruction. He had never seen anything like it. And then came the attention he didn't want. It started with offers. A man from the district office arrived, dressed too clean for farmland. He spoke politely at first, asking questions about advanced machinery, but his interest was too sharp to be casual. This kind of equipment could be useful for large-scale operations, the man said. The government would be willing to evaluate it for acquisition. Elias shook his head. It's not for sale. The man smiled faintly. Everything has a price. After he left, others came. Some introduced themselves as engineers, others as investors. One claimed to represent a private agricultural corporation. None of them looked at Elias as a farmer anymore. They looked at him as a gatekeeper to something they did not understand. But not everyone came with interest. Some came with concern, and others with fear. One evening, while Elias was inspecting the crawler, he noticed something disturbing. A thin scratch line across one of the external panels. It hadn't been there before. He traced it with his finger. It was deliberate, not accidental damage, but a cut made with intent. Someone had tried to access the internal structure. He didn't tell anyone. But that night, he stayed in the barn longer than usual. And that's when the second incident happened. A low mechanical hum echoed through the barn, different from before. Not activation, not startup. Interference. The crawler's internal systems flickered briefly, as if responding to something external. Elias stepped back immediately. "What are you reacting to?" he whispered. The hum stopped, but the unease remained. The next morning confirmed his suspicion. A section of the wiring panel had been tampered with. Not damaged. Tested. Someone had been inside the barn. And they knew exactly what they were looking for. Elias tightened security as best he could, though in a place like Maranpur, security mostly meant locked doors and sleepless nights. But the real threat arrived 2 days later. He heard it before he saw it. Engines. Not farming engines, not tractors. These were different, controlled, multiple, synchronized. Vehicles rolling in formation along the dirt road toward his land. When he stepped outside, he saw them. 3 black utility trucks. No markings. No introductions. Just presence. They stopped near the edge of his property. A man stepped out. He wore no uniform, but his posture made it clear he didn't need one. He looked toward the barn, then toward Elias. "We need to discuss the crawler," he said. Elias didn't respond. The man continued, "What you've activated is not agricultural equipment. It's a prototype system, classified under industrial development recovery programs." Elias frowned. "It's a farm machine." The man shook his head. "It was never meant for farming." Silence followed. For the first time since he had started repairing it, Elias felt something unfamiliar. Not pride. Not curiosity. But pressure. Because suddenly, the crawler wasn't just something he had restored. It was something people were willing to come for. And take. The man took one step closer. "We are authorized to retrieve it." Elias turned slightly toward the barn. Inside it, the crawler sat still, but not inactive. Waiting again. And for the first time, Elias understood something dangerous. Whatever he had awakened was no longer only his responsibility. And now, others were ready to claim it. The morning after the trucks arrived, Maranpur felt like it was holding its breath. No one spoke openly about what had happened at Elias' farm, but everyone knew something had changed. Word travels fast in villages like this, not through announcements, but through glances, rumors, and the kind of silence that grows heavier than noise. Elias stood inside the barn long before sunrise. The crawler was still there. Still waiting. But now, it didn't feel like a machine that had been rediscovered. It felt like something that had been claimed by attention it never asked for. The marks from the attempted intrusion were still visible. The presence of those unknown men still lingered in his mind. They had not taken the crawler, but they had made their intention clear. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was pursuit. Outside, the sky was turning a dull gray. Storm clouds were gathering far beyond the fields, rolling in slow and heavy, the kind of weather that farmers usually read like a warning. Elias placed his hand on the crawler's frame. For the first time, he didn't speak to it like a man trying to fix something. He spoke like someone making a decision. "They're coming back," he said quietly, "and I don't know what they'll do when they do." The crawler gave no visible response. but something inside it felt present. That presence had become familiar now, not loud, not obvious, but constant, like pressure beneath still water. By mid-morning, the storm hit. Not a disaster at first, just heavy rain, wind pushing across the fields, cutting visibility. But within hours, reports began to spread through the village. The main irrigation channel upstream had collapsed. A critical drainage barrier had failed under pressure, sending water rushing uncontrollably toward the lower farmlands. And Mehranpur sat directly in its path. Panic spread quickly. If the flood wasn't controlled, it would destroy what little remained of the harvest season. Years of recovery washed away in hours. Farmers rushed to their equipment, but it was useless. Engines stalled in the rain, wheels sank in mud. The storm had turned every modern machine into dead weight. Ilya stood still for a moment. Then he walked into the barns. The crawler was already powered. Not fully active, but awake. As if it had been waiting for the moment it was needed. He climbed into the cabin without hesitation. Outside, someone shouted, "Ilyas, you can't take that thing out in this storm." But he didn't stop. The crawler moved forward. Slow at first. Then steady. Then certain. It rolled out into the rain like something older than the storm itself. Its treads bit into the soaked earth, carving deep, controlled paths through land that was already breaking apart. The wind howled. Rain slammed against metal. But the crawler didn't hesitate. Ilyas guided it toward the flood path. The situation became clear as he approached. The barrier upstream had completely collapsed. Water was pouring down like a broken wall of the river itself, unstoppable and violent. People were running from nearby fields, shouting, falling, trying to escape what couldn't be outrun. Ilyas brought the crawler to the edge of the flooding path. For a moment, he just watched it. Then he made a decision. He pushed the machine forward. The crawler didn't resist. It entered the flood zone. Water slammed against its frame, but it held. The machine pushed forward against the current, digging into the ground beneath, reinforcing the collapsing soil with its weight and structure. It wasn't just moving through the flood. It was fighting it. The villagers watched from a distance, frozen. "That thing is going to get destroyed," someone shouted. But it didn't. Instead, something unexpected happened. The crawler systems adjusted again, responding to force, pressure, and terrain. Its stabilizers extended deeper into the ground, anchoring it. Its frame shifted slightly, redistributing load across its structure. It wasn't just resisting the flood. It was redirecting it. Ilyas realized what it was doing too late to doubt it. The machine wasn't built for farming. It was built for control in unstable environments. Slowly, almost impossibly, the crawler began stabilizing the edge of the collapse zone. The water flow changed direction slightly, just enough to reduce pressure on the farmland below. It wasn't stopping the flood, but it was saving what it could. Behind him, voices rose in disbelief. "That's impossible. It's holding the river back." The rain continued, but the disaster lost its momentum. Not through human force, but through something engineered to endure it. Hours passed. The storm eventually weakened. When it did, the floodwaters began to settle into redirected channels instead of destroying the fields. Damage had occurred, but not total destruction. The village survived. Barely. Ilyas sat inside the crawler long after the danger had passed. His hands were still on the controls, but he wasn't moving anymore. Outside, people slowly approached. Not with laughter. Not with skepticism. But with something heavier. Respect mixed with confusion. And fear of what they had just witnessed. The black trucks never returned. Neither did the men who had spoken of retrieval. Because whatever they had come for was no longer something they could simply take. As the rain finally stopped, Ilyas stepped down from the crawler. Mud covered everything. The fields were scarred but standing. The machine behind him slowly powered down into quiet stillness again. A farmer approached carefully. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Elias looked at the crawler for a long time before answering. "I don't think it was ever just a machine," he said. A pause. Then softer. "I think it remembers what it was built to do." The wind moved through the fields. And for the first time, the village didn't look at the crawler as scrap. Or even as equipment. They looked at it as something that had once been forgotten. And had chosen to return when it was needed most.